All Might was never the strongest man in the room. That sounds wrong because visually, narratively, symbolically, he was. But the truth of All Might begins with something quieter. He was the man who chose to carry fear so others wouldn't have to. Before the muscles, before the smile, before the words, "I am here," there was a world already breaking. My Hero Academia doesn't begin in an age of hope. It begins in an age of dependency. A society so accustomed to heroes that people stopped learning how to stand on their own. Crime didn't disappear, it adapted. Fear didn't vanish, it just learned where to hide. And in that fragile equilibrium, All Might became something unprecedented. Not a hero, a pillar. A symbol is not meant to act. It is meant to be seen. And that distinction is everything. All Might understood something no one else did. That peace in a world of quirks was not maintained by laws or institutions, but by certainty. As long as villains believed All Might would arrive, they hesitated. As long as civilians believed he could arrive, they endured. Hope wasn't emotional, it was logistical. And so All Might made himself larger than life on purpose. The exaggerated smile, the booming voice, the American bravado that felt almost comedic. That wasn't ego, that was theater. Because fear spreads faster than truth, and symbols move faster than reason. But here's the quiet tragedy. A symbol cannot rest. The moment All Might became peace itself, he forfeited the right to be human. He couldn't bleed in public, he couldn't doubt in public, he couldn't grieve in public. Even his injury, the one that slowly killed him, had to be hidden like a state secret. Not because people wouldn't understand, but because understanding would break the spell. And All Might knew that. Every smile after his fight with All for One was heavier than the last. Every victory cost him something he could never recover. This is why All Might's decline is so painful to watch. Not because he's losing power, but because he's losing utility. In a world that only knows how to lean on him, what happens when the pillar cracks? That question haunted him long before Midoriya ever appeared. Which brings us to the most misunderstood moment in the entire series. When All Might looks at a quirkless boy and says, "You can't be a hero." People hear cruelty, but what All Might was actually doing was confessing. Because he knew exactly what the path demanded. He had already paid the price, and he didn't want to damn another child to the same fate. All Might didn't reject Deku because he lacked power. He rejected him because he lacked protection. Because All Might knew this truth better than anyone. Hope consumes the people who become it. When All Might chose Izuku Midoriya, it wasn't because Deku was brave. Plenty of people are brave. It wasn't because he was kind. Kindness is common. It was because for one irrational, reckless moment, Deku moved without permission. The sludge villain incident is often framed as Deku's origin, but it's actually All Might's awakening. All Might had already saved the day. He had already neutralized the threat. He had already done what the symbol was supposed to do. And yet, something lingered. Bakugo was still trapped. The crowd was still frozen. The pro-heroes, capable, trained, licensed, stood still. Because symbols don't just inspire courage, they can replace it. And in that vacuum, a quirkless child ran forward while everyone else waited for someone stronger. I think that broke All Might. You see it in his silence, in the way his confidence collapses inward for just a second. Because Deku didn't move despite being weak. He moved because someone had to. That moment forced All Might to confront the cost of the world he created. Peace had made people spectators, and the symbol of peace had unknowingly taught them to wait. So when All Might passes one for all to Deku, it is not a triumphant inheritance. It is an apology. I failed to build a world that could stand without me. So I'm asking you to do what I couldn't. And that guilt never leaves him. You see, during the USJ incident, All Might arrives late. For the first time, the students are exposed to real death, real malice, without the guarantee of safety. And when All Might finally enters, he doesn't just fight normal, he overperforms. He goes beyond what his body can handle, not to win, but to reassert certainty. Because symbols don't get second chances. You see, the villains needed to believe All Might was still unstoppable. The students needed to believe heroes would always come. And All Might needed to believe it himself. But every punch against normal shortened the clock. Every plus ultra was borrowed time. This is the quiet irony of All Might. The more people relied on him, the less time he had to protect them. And nowhere is this more evident than Kamino Ward. Kamino isn't just a fight. It's a public execution of a symbol. All for One doesn't try to kill All Might in secret. He drags him into the open, into the cameras, into the screaming crowd, into history. Because All for One understands symbols too. He knows that defeating All Might physically isn't enough. He has to be exposed as finite. And for the first time, All Might fights not to win, but to end the story properly. He burns the last embers of One for All, not out of rage, but intention. Each blow is slower. Each impact is heavier. Each breath sounds final. And when All Might raises his fist for the last time, he isn't striking All for One. He's striking the idea that peace can be maintained by a single man. That final United States of Smash isn't patriotism. It's closure. And when All Might points to the camera, skeletal, exhausted, exposed, and says, "Now it's your turn," that isn't a challenge. It's a confession to the entire world. I can no longer carry this alone. It's Midoriya's turn. The symbol doesn't fall because it's defeated. It falls because it chooses to stop lying. And what follows is the most honest arc in My Hero Academia. All Might learning how to exist without being needed, teaching without power, protecting without dominance, smiling without certainty. And this is where he becomes something greater than a symbol, a witness. He watches Deku suffer the same self-destructive instincts he once had. He sees the cost of inherited ideals, and unlike before, he doesn't pretend it's painless. When Night Eye dies believing All Might was destined to perish violently, it forces All Might to confront something even darker, that symbols don't get to grow old, that the world expects them to die at their peak. And for the first time, All Might resists that narrative, not by fighting but by living, by choosing to remain, by choosing to guide instead of dominate. Because true hope isn't invincibility, it's continuity. All Might and Midoriya share the same sickness. It isn't recklessness, it isn't selfishness, it isn't even martyrdom. It's the inability to believe they are allowed to be saved. All Might didn't become a symbol because he wanted to be worshipped. He became one because he didn't trust anyone else to hold the line. That belief is what made him great, and what made him dangerous. Because when one person decides they must shoulder everything, they teach the world a silent lesson. You don't need to act. I'll suffer for you. Deku inherits this flaw immediately. We see it in the entrance exam, shattering his body to save Uraraka. We see it in the sports festival, destroying his arms rather than adapting. We see it against Muscular, choosing mutual annihilation over retreat. And every time, All Might sees himself. That's why his praise is restrained. That's why his pride is haunted. Because One for All doesn't just pass power, it passes philosophy. The reason All Might could never fix hero society is because he stood above it. The reason Deku did is because he stands among it. This distinction matters. All Might inspired people to feel safe. Deku inspires people to move. You can see the difference during the Overhaul arc. All Might would have ended Overhaul in a single overwhelming display. Deku, he doesn't. He fights alongside Eri's pain. He borrows strength instead of embodying it. He wins because someone else enables him to. And that's not weakness, that's evolution. And All Might notices. Quietly, proudly, painfully. This is why All Might's roar after Kamino is so restrained. He doesn't insert himself into decisions, he doesn't posture as authority, he just watches. Because for the first time in his life, he is not the answer. And that terrifies him. Not because he fears irrelevance, but because he fears the consequences of failure without the ability to intervene. That fear peaks during the Dark Deku arc, when Deku isolates himself, when he pushes everyone away, when he tries to become a symbol instead of a person. All Might follows him, not as a mentor, not as a hero, but as a ghost. A man watching his own mistake repeat itself. And when Deku finally collapses, surrounded by classmates who refuse to abandon him, something unprecedented happens in the story. The burden fractures. Hope stops being vertical. It becomes horizontal. And in that moment, All Might's legacy is corrected. Not erased, corrected. Because the greatest lie All Might ever told wasn't, "I am here." It was what came after. "You can leave this to me." Hero Society doesn't need another All Might. It needs a world where All Might is no longer necessary. And All Might understands that now, which is why he survives. Not as fan service, not as mercy, but as consequence. Because a symbol that lives long enough to see itself replaced becomes a teacher instead of a monument. And that, more than any punch, any victory, any smile, is All Might's final triumph. All Might and All for One are not opposites. They are answers to the same question. What do you do with power when the world is afraid? All for One looked at chaos and saw opportunity. A fractured society, people terrified of their own quirks, a world begging for control. So he did what tyrants always do. He offered relief. He took people's fears and turned them into transactions. Safety in exchange for obedience, power in exchange for loyalty. And because it worked, people followed him willingly. All for One didn't rule through destruction. He ruled through dependency. Which is why his name matters. All for One. It doesn't mean generosity. It means everything flows to me. All Might unknowingly built the mirror image, where All for One said, "Give me your power." All Might said, "I'll carry it for you." Both removed agency. Both centralized hope. Both created worlds that couldn't function without them. The difference was actually intention, not outcome. This is why All for One never hated All Might. He admired him. Because All Might perfected what All for One only approximated. A single figure so overwhelming that resistance felt pointless. Crime dropped not because villains were gone, but because they were afraid to act. That is not justice. That is deterrence. And All for One understood the flaw immediately. Remove the figure, and the system collapses. Which is why he never rushed to kill All Might. He waited. He let time rot him from the inside. He let Hero Society grow fragile, lazy, dependent. And when he finally reappeared, it wasn't to win a fight. It was to expose a lie. Kamino Ward is ideological warfare. All for One doesn't taunt All Might about strength. He taunts him about legacy. You raised the next generation poorly. Because in All for One's worldview, people do not rise to responsibility. They seek shelter. And All Might, despite his goodness, proved him right. This is why Shigaraki exists. Not as a failure of heroes, but as the logical outcome of a world built on symbols instead of systems. All for One creates monsters by exploiting despair. All Might creates them by ignoring it. He stops the crime, he never fixes the conditions. And when All Might finally defeats All for One, something crucial happens. The world doesn't heal. It destabilizes. Villains multiply, faith erodes, heroes quit. Because All Might's victory was never structural, it was performative. And All Might realizes this too late. That's why his final act against All for One isn't triumph, it's defiance. He doesn't prove that good wins, he proves that evil does not get the last word. That matters. But it isn't enough. The true ideological defeat of All for One doesn't come from All Might. It comes from what All Might could never be, a collective. Deku doesn't oppose All for One by standing taller, he opposes him by refusing to stand alone. Where All for One hoards quirks, Deku shares the burden. Where All Might internalized hope, Deku distributes it. That's why All for One hates Deku more. Because Deku represents a world where power doesn't create hierarchy, it creates connection. And that is the one thing All for One can never control. All Might was the perfect counter to All for One's strength, but Deku is the counter to his philosophy. And All Might knows it, which is why he steps aside, not because he is weak, but because his way has reached its limit. The age of symbols ends, the age of shared responsibility begins, and that transaction, painful, chaotic, uncertain, is the true war All Might and All for One were always fighting over.